Let's take these fabulous stones and turn them into an incredible pair of earrings. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, it's Jen B, and welcome to my studio. So as you saw, we're going to be taking some onyx and blue dendritic stones and turning them into some earrings. For this design, I chose to do a bezel for the onyx and a frame with prongs for the blue dendritic stone. I'm giving you a little peek of my notes, and here you'll see an exact trace out of the stones, which I'm going to use to form the frame. I've got some rectangle wire that I am forming with my fingers and some pliers, unfortunately a little bit off the screen, and just forming it to match the shape of the stones, using a marker to mark where I need to bend and shape the wire. So once I've got that one side all done, I've got the other side already completed. So I'm going to put the frame together, trying to figure out exactly where they're supposed to go. There we go. And then I'm going to start to file in like little miters so that the two pieces of wire fit together perfectly. So that's what I'm doing there, and then just checking to make sure that that miter fits. And once it looks just perfect, I head over to the soldering area. I've got the frame set up with some T-pins in a honeycomb soldering board. I picked up a little piece of solder with my pick and dropped it right on the two seams where the frames meet. And then I will get that solder to flow. And I'm just working on getting everything to temperature, making sure that it flows all the way through the seam. And once it's been quenched and pickled, I cut off any excess wire and then shape the frame using a file and some sandpaper rolls. Making sure to remove any excess solder, shaping everything real nicely. And then I'm showing you here the wire that I'm going to be using for the prongs. This is 14 gauge half round wire that I've just cut into little sections. And here's what I'm going to be attempting to use to solder the frames or solder the prongs down. That is Hold It clay, Hold It soldering clay. So I've got the prongs and the frame set up in the clay, getting them ready to solder with the flux, and grabbing my flux bowl, dipping little pieces of solder in the flux and then placing them right up against the prong so that they are touching the prong and the frame. Then heating those up, grabbing my pick in my other hand and nudging those solder pieces back into place as they move a little bit. Flux bubbles up as it is being warmed, so sometimes the solder gets out of place. Being careful not to melt the tips of the prong. They're kind of suspended in midair and can melt really easily. So I'm just making sure that everything gets soldered down, and whoops, my pick dragged the whole piece across the soldering board. Those two prongs did not adhere completely, or the solder didn't flow completely between the prong and the frame, so I was just using some soldering tweezers to squeeze them closed so that they could get a nice strong bond with each other. Clipping off the bottoms of the prongs and filing everything flat, I had a really difficult time holding it and getting my file in there so that you could see what I was doing. So I just opted to use my flex shaft and some sanding rolls. Getting those all nice and smooth. And once that's complete, I grab my sanding clipboard and give the back of the frame a really nice sanding so that everything looks uniform and great. All right, and then giving you a little look at how the stone is going to sit in the frame. It's going to be just perfect. I do notice there a little bit of excess metal, and I try to squeeze it in so that it was hidden behind the stone. It sort of deformed the frame a little bit, but that's all right. And now I'm going to be moving on to getting the bezel for the black onyx stone. The stone is round, and so I can use a formula to figure out exactly the length of bezel wire I need. So I just wrote the formula down in my notebook, and then I'm taking a measurement of the black onyx. I need the diameter of the black onyx for the formula, which is 10.3 millimeters, grabbing my bezel wire and measuring the thickness of the bezel wire, adding that into the formula. And then I multiply that by pi. So I grab my tablet, you can see I'm watching T that day, and then I'm just plugging in all the numbers into my calculator, adding the diameter of the stone plus the thickness of the wire, multiplying it by pi, and that gives me the length that I need to cut my bezel wire. So I'm setting up my calipers to do that. I measured a little extra, but that's okay. And then marking where I need to cut, cutting it off, doing that again, and you will see here that I am not using a miter vise to get a nice 90-degree angle on my wires. I'm really trying to practice my filing skills, so I did not use a miter vise for this entire project. Okay, got the wires cut. I will file the other sides and make sure that those are nice and perfectly flat and 90 degrees. Then with some half-round wires, I am curving them. I'm curving the bezel into a sort of circle so that those ends can meet, and then working at getting them perfectly aligned so the solder can flow. And back over at my soldering bench, my soldering tweezers had become a little distorted in the previous soldering operation, so I'm just heating those tweezers up and then using some pliers to squeeze them back into place. And here's my bezels. I've got some solder chips out on the soldering board, and I'm putting the seam of the bezels on top of the solder. Getting my torch lit. Always fun to see the torch getting lit. And heating those up, and then I'm zooming in for you so that you can really see that solder flow. I find it so fascinating to watch the solder flow. Heating it up, and there the solder jumped into the seam. Back over at my bench, there's a lot of back and forth in jewelry making, but that's all right. So at my bench, I am working at getting the bezels to a circular shape using a mandrel and a nylon mallet. Checking to make sure that the shape is nice and round. Then I'll compare it on the stone, and you can see that I've got a perfect fit. Gonna be wonderful. And then I will saw out the back plate. I've just marked it off where I need to saw it. I really wish that sawing went this fast. It doesn't, and I really would like it to. And here I'm grabbing a sanding sponge to clean off the metal. Solder cannot flow if metal is dirty, so I'm getting off any grime, oxidation, any marker, whatever might be in the way of the solder. Now here I am taking a look at the frame and comparing it to the height of the bezel. I decided that the bezel was a little too tall in comparison to the size of the frame. So I cut off a little bit of the bezel. You'll see me using a divider to draw a line around the bezel and then cutting off that excess. But I realized later that I made a huge mistake at this point, and that was I compared the height of the bezel to the frame without the stone in the frame. So the proportions were really, really off, and the bezel was much too short for the scale of the frame and the stone. So later on in the process, I realized my mistake and I had to go back and remake the bezels. But I left this part in to show you that mistakes happen and they can be fixed. Most mistakes can be fixed, or they can be redone, which all it takes is a little bit more time and you get more soldering practice in the process. So really not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. Over at the soldering area, I'm going to get the bezels soldered down. Yes, the ones that were too short because I had not realized my mistake yet, but that's all right. So I'm fluxing the front and the back, or the back and the front of the back plate, and then adding my bezels, deciding where I want them, and adding the solder to the inside of the bezels. Alright, so we're going to warm everything up to temperature, get the solder to flow all the way around the edges. I'm using my pick to just make sure that the solder is right up against the bezel and touching the back plate. Heating from the top and underneath. And then once it starts to flow, I go for a spin to pull the solder all the way around. Over at my bench now, I am cutting some very thin and very small bead wire to use as a decoration on the outside of the bezel. So I just cut off the length that I need. I used a formula again. And I go to file it, and then I stop before I filed it and really just trying to make sure that I have everything correctly cut before I file away anything that I need. And here we are. I'm going to get those soldered together. I've got some solder off camera and I use my pick and drop it into the seam. But then I realized, oops, that was not the right place to put that solder. So I had to go back and get another piece of solder and then successfully got it soldered together. I shaped it on a mandrel and then I put it through my rolling mill to flatten it and give it this kind of cool decorative look. And I'm marking the tops of those so that I know which way to put them up onto the bezels once I get them soldered down, making sure that they fit around the bezels, and giving you a little look. And this is the stage where I realize my mistake and I need to redo the bezels. So I'm at my soldering area and I'm going to unsolder those bezels. When you are unsoldering, you just need to get everything up to temperature so that the solder will flow, and then you will see me pulling away those bezels once the solder is flowing. And then I smartly put the stone in the frame and am comparing it to different bezel heights so that I can choose the bezel height that I want. I'm getting the new bezels all soldered up. Like I said, this is just more practice under the flame and not a big deal at all. Happens to all of us. Okay, getting those new bezels soldered to the back plate. You can also see that I've added some solder to the outside of the bezels. I'm going to flow that solder so that I can then add the flattened beaded wire on top of it, and it will get soldered to the back plate. Going for a spin, and you can see the solder is starting to melt and puddle onto the back plate. And I unfortunately did not hit record when I soldered the flattened bead wire to the back plate, but there it is, looking great. Spending some time getting it sawed out. Again, really wish that sawing went this quickly, would be so wonderful. Silversmithing is not a quick process. There's a lot of steps, it takes time, but it is oh so much fun. Alright, once it's all sawed out, I'm going to file it smooth using a file, and then I use a sanding wheel. That sanding wheel had been used up, so I just cut it and tore it off. And so now I'm using that sanding roll to continue smoothing out the back plate. And now comes the most fiddly part of this whole process. I decided to use a teeny tiny tube and jump ring to connect the frame to the bezel. So you can see me here trying to get that little tube connected to the frame. And it was fiddly, it kept sticking, the solder would flow and pull the tube to the wrong side of the frame. But I did eventually get them both soldered. You can see my gigantic head keeps getting in the way. Got it soldered down for both of them. And then I move on to working on the bezel. I'm going to put 2 jump rings at the top and the bottom to connect one to the ear wire and the other one to the frame. So I've got the jump ring propped up on, I think it's called a woodruff key or something like that, woodruff key. Anyway, getting a little piece of solder and putting it inside of the jump ring and getting it to flow. This part was easy peasy. And then I'm just spending some time shaping that tube that is connected to the frames. I want to make sure that it sits on the jump ring real nice and has some movement and isn't too big for the jump ring. So I'm filing in a little bit of an angle, which you can see there. And then I will thread a jump ring through that tube and get it soldered to the bezel. So I've got everything set up right where I want it, getting it heated up, and in just a moment I will add a little piece of solder using my pick. I bounce back and forth between using my tweezers and my pick to place solder, just kind of whatever I feel like in the moment. Okay, bringing that up to temperature. I say that a lot because that's what we do a lot, is get things up to the temperature where solder will flow. Okay, everything has been soldered and pickled, and there it is. They look great. So I am going to spend some time polishing them, removing any nicks and marks that I may have put in as I was creating the piece, using my ever-favorite radial disc brushes to do that. Also using a rotary tool called a scratch eraser to get rid of some little nicks. And then I throw it in the tumbler. For these pieces, I opted to use the Hone and Highlight tumbling medium, which is the thing that I use for every single piece that I make. And then I decided to put it in my steel shot tumbler for about 10 minutes. I had seen someone else do that, and that their piece still had a patina, but it had a little bit of a shine to it, and I typically like a satin finish, but I wanted to see how I felt about this, so did a little experiment with this piece. And this is what they look like after 10 minutes in some steel shot. It still has, some patina, and it does have a little bit of a shine. It is not high polished at all, and I'm kind of liking it for this piece. I am marking off here how tall to cut the prongs. There we go. Then I'll cut those prongs right at the marks, making sure those pieces don't go flying off into my studio. And then I will file them into a nice curve, a subtle curve, but just getting those sharp edges removed. And then here I am marking off some circles. And what I'm going to be doing is using an old gift card. This one belonged to my husband, but using an old gift card to create some lift inside the bezels. There's lots of different techniques to lifting a stone to the correct height inside the bezel. Some people use sawdust, some people use cardboard, some people use other metals or even silver, and some people reuse different items like yogurt containers, or in my case, a gift card. And there is no right or wrong way to do it. Every silversmith has their own opinion on what is the best to use, but I like to reuse what I have, so that's what I did in this case. So I'm putting in the black onyx inside the bezel and going around and setting it. You could see I've got a piece of, it's cork, but it's the back side of the cork, just as a protection between the metal and my bench block so it doesn't get scraped. And then I am setting the prongs. I noticed that one got a little twisted, so fixing it and then setting those prongs. And once that is all complete, I added the stones, or I added the finished earring to the ear wires, and here they are. I love them. I love the movement that they have. I love the combination of the two stones together and the setting of the bezel with the frame and the prongs. I think it really has a great look to it, and I'm really in love with these earrings. These were the stones that won a community poll that I put up asking which stones I should use to make my next pair of earrings, and they are now complete, and I am going to wear them, and I can't wait. Thank you so much for joining me for this. I hope you enjoyed seeing these two stones be turned into a great pair of earrings, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.